Hey everybody, thank you for watching. I know this is kind of a different way of doing things, but due to time constraints, this is probably the best way to get you some of this information, break down some of the text, and keep on schedule. That way we don't have to lose 2 days instead of just the one. So I'll have the slides up kind of like this. Hopefully that's big enough for you to see. If not, you can just kind of minimize the video and you'll be able to pull up the slides on your own. I will attach them to Google Classroom. So I've never done this before, so we're just gonna try and see how this goes. The first line in this presentation is a painting by a victim who was at Auschwitz, the concentration camp. Is notorious as a death camp and as a forced labor camp. And what these prisoners here are doing, in the bottom right hand corner you can see two of them hauling off a dead or injured inmate. You can see the SS guards in the background sometimes. I think what they're doing is they're actually digging a drainage canal. So this is kind of what we're building to. It's not pleasant to look at, but it's good to keep in mind that that's kind of where we're going with some of this. The intro to this chapter or this unit is really more about setting up these governments, understanding what some of them are about, and the differences between them. So we'll go ahead and move on here to the next. All right, so we've got authoritarian states. We've dealt with authoritarianism before, but now we're going to kind of change tacks with some of the governments that we are seeing. So we've got conservative authoritarianism, which is what we're pretty much used to with this class. What we've been looking at all throughout the year has been what we consider conservative authoritarianism. These are governments usually run by one person, but they do tend to rely on a bureaucracy, a group of people who run the government, who manage things for them. Tend to be pretty, as the name says, conservative, so downplaying individual liberties, liberal reforms, and things like that. So when you think of conservative authoritarianism, think Louis XIV, think Metternich of Austria, think Catherine the Great of Russia, and things like that. So that would be conservative authoritarianism. They are not super concerned with controlling the behaviors and beliefs of the people, just simply making sure that they pay their taxes, which was the main way that these governments controlled their people. Moving on, we get totalitarianism really out of the First World War. Because of the nature of total war and the effect that it has on society, totalitarianism is going to crop up kind of almost as a byproduct. The mental shift that total war requires of a society, of a group of people, is pretty significant. And this is going to be almost a natural fit for a society that is in total war. So this is a government usually run by a charismatic leader, somebody who the people instinctively trust or like, or they want to kind of be like this person, and maybe aspire to be like this person. And so a totalitarian government does seek to control the attitudes, beliefs, actions, psychology, economy, all of those things, the social values of a culture, usually a nation state. And so that's exactly what we're dealing with. We're going to look at 3 totalitarian regimes. So you have Italy, you've got Germany, and you've got the Soviet Union. Those are the 3. And so we've got communist and fascist dictatorships. Communist obviously fits with the Soviet Union, which we kind of go into first in this presentation and in the coming slides. And fascist dictatorships, that's going to be more Italy and Germany. So I guess with communism first, we've kind of gone through the 3 tenets of communism: no private property, class struggle, global revolution. Those are the main pieces there. It's the end goal is to be a classless society that really doesn't need a government telling people what to do, versus a fascist dictatorship. That there are more differences between the two, but these are the big ones. A fascist dictatorship is going to seek not to necessarily reform the classes. There is an ethnic component to fascism, where typical fascist dictatorships do seek ethnic purity or racial purity. So eugenics is going to come into play. We see that in both Germany and Italy, especially with Nazism. There's a component of a pretty obviously large component of racial purity, and so eugenics is the study. It's kind of a pseudoscience, if you could call it that, of racial purity, the idea of selectively breeding humans to produce a quote unquote master race, kind of an Ubermensch idea, which you just read about Nietzsche, and he talks about the Übermensch, kind of the Superman, this idea of you can arrive at the ideal human being, and then a population of ideal human beings would be the ideal nation. And you can only get that through the requirements of that a fascist dictator imposes on a society. And so both of these things come out of the First World War, World War One. So we will pick up there in just a moment. One note here before we move on from this, so there are some similarities between the two of them. Both rely on censorship, both rely on kind of oppressive government mandates, maintaining control over, as we mentioned before, the thoughts and behaviors of the population. So there's some similarities. Both of them do have kind of a racial component, whereas I mentioned with fascism, it's going to be more eugenics and breeding and also deportations, and there's going to be solving that issue through mass killings and things like that. Communism does that more through social class persecution, and so they will multiple times the Soviet Union will cast a certain ethnic group or a certain population in the light of they are the bourgeois, they are the wrong social class, and so we must get rid of them. So there is that component with communism. The two of them are mutual enemies. They don't get along. Hitler hated communists, and communists hated Hitler. The two do not get along because of their kind of just their different worldview, the way you run things, the way you run a nation, and things like that. So we'll kind of move on to Stalin's Russia first. This is a pretty interesting painting. This is obviously propaganda. We see lots and lots of red, and this is going to be the red state. So we see down in the right hand bottom corner, there's the hammer and sickle, the symbols of the workers' paradise. And here's Stalin over on the right in his white suit, and he's graciously accepting flowers from people from all over the Soviet Union. If you take a look at their faces, you'll notice a lot of them are wearing different hairstyles, different hats, that they have different faces. They represent all the different ethnicities within the Soviet Union. And if we look ahead here, one slide, this is the Soviet Union by 1936. It's absolutely massive. So you've got the Russian, what you would maybe call the core of the former Russian Empire, but then you've also got these satellite states. And over the course of World War II, the Soviet Union is obviously going to expand into Poland and on through Germany there. So this is a massive place. You can see there's a lot of different ethnicities that are going to be represented. We go from Eastern Europe all the way over to Western Asia in this one country, or maybe this one socialist group of socialist republics. The USSR is Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, just so you know. So lots of things are going to change in the Soviet Union under Stalin. One of them is the 5-year plan. It's something that he implements early on in his career as premier of the Soviet Union. And what the 5-year plan is basically the natural conclusion of a command economy. A command economy is one where all decisions in the economy are made from the top down in the United States, and pretty much most of what we would call the Western world, and most of the world actually, there is a bottom-up economy. Capitalism decisions are usually made, for the most part, ideally, by the consumer. So bottom-up, demand creates those decisions. Versus command economy is from the top down. So the 5-year plan was implemented, I think, in 1926, in order to basically set the goals for the Soviet Union for the next 5 years. Recovering from World War I, you're missing a generation of people. The Soviet Union suffered immensely due to the loss of people. They're also recovering from their own civil war and the communist revolution. So they're just kind of coming out of this phase of total destruction and total war. So they're really looking to build themselves back up, to start competing with other Western nations, to be competing with the rest of the world. Otherwise, they're going to fizzle out. And I think Stalin knew that. So the 5-year plan sets rigid deadlines, rigid goals for all parts of industry, from steel manufacturing to military production to farming, which is going to end up being collectivized. That's coming up here. The new economic policy was actually something started by Lenin. So if you back up a little bit, and I guess for you it's this way, maybe, I don't know. If you back up a little bit and you go back to Lenin, he started what he called the new economic policy. Communism does not provide for economic freedom in the same sense that capitalism does, where if you have a product, you can sell it in a marketplace for profit, for your own personal gain. I think Lenin realized the situation that the Soviet Union was in. They would need some of that outside economic stimulation in order to survive, to kind of boost agricultural and industrial production. And so this plan allowed people who worked on farms, who worked in industry, to sell privately some of their surplus goods, some of their surplus crops, some of their surplus crafts and things like that. And so it allowed them to have a little bit of this side money almost in order to stimulate economic growth elsewhere. Lenin dies, as we all do, and there is this question of who's going to be the next leader of the Soviet Union. And there's kind of this core group of people that run the Communist Party in the Soviet Union at that point. And it's, you can imagine they're all kind of looking at each other, realizing that they're going to be in a competition to see who the next premier is. And it's going to end up being Stalin, but he didn't get it just because he wanted it. He actually had to kind of fight for this. And the person he was in this contest was Leon Trotsky, who we know from the Communist Revolution. So if you don't know him, go look him up. Leon Trotsky was commanding the Red Army, and he was this great propagandist. And the two of them didn't necessarily fight it out on the battlefield. They fought it out more in a war of words. Leon Trotsky's vision of continued communism was the state of what he called constant revolution or eternal revolution, where he saw the communist revolution as never being finished, never being something that we give up on, something that we always need to keep renewing, and we need to keep the spirit of that revolution alive. Whereas Stalin saw this as, look, we did it. We're done. Communism is here, and we're going to keep it where we've got it. We're going to move forward. And he called it communism in one country, or I'm pretty sure that's what he called it, communism in one country, meaning that all of these communist nations would come together and act as one, instead of this idea of continual, we're never finished. And so Stalin makes some political allies with outside nations like Turkey, and they end up supporting him. So he does have outside backing, some international backing. A lot of the Western powers are already wary of what Stalin is doing, and some of the things that are coming up are going to be pretty brutal. So we will continue on. Hey, so I'm in a different location now. I ran out of battery at home, so had to move here the day after. So anyways, we were at the first 5-year plan. First 5-year plan called for a tremendous increase in industrialization and agriculture. I think 250% increase in industrial output and 150% increase in agricultural output. And the way that they were going to do some of that, at least with agriculture, was with collectivization. So, and imagine everybody kind of getting together kind of for the common good. It's kind of a common theme with communism anyways. And the kulaks. Now, the kulaks they sound similar to gulags, but they're different. Gulags are work camps, re-education camps, and labor camps. Kulaks is a group, it's a population group. They're wealthy peasants. And so these wealthy peasants, a lot of them owned their own land, and basically anybody who had land at this point in the USSR, they owned their own land. Kulaks owned a lot of land. They typically owned a lot of equipment and livestock and things like that. And Stalin saw them as a major threat to communism, that they owned a huge portion of the potential agricultural output of the Soviet Union. And so in order to prevent them from bringing capitalism back, because basically communism was going to hurt their bottom line, in order to prevent them from bringing capitalism back, he actually strips them of all of their land, all of their equipment and things like that. They are forced into cities to go work in factories and things like that. And about 93% of the other peasant population is forced to go then work on these collectivized farms. So all farmland is basically smushed into one big farm. You can kind of consider the USSR as one big farm, run by the government with agricultural outputs mandated, for each plot of land. Eventually, Stalin would allow families to farm their own little tiny plot, and so about the way that worked out, because those families got to eat whatever came out of that plot, 28% of the USSR's agricultural output, so over a quarter of the USSR's agriculture, came out of 4% of the land mass. Because these families knew that that was their produce, then that means that they worked extra hard on that land. And so then the collectivized farms didn't produce as much as they could have. It doesn't work as well when you're basically telling everybody that they don't get any proceeds, they don't get any benefit from raising those crops. They just then give them to the state. And it was actually punishable by death. They would shoot you if you were caught stealing from the produce or the livestock that was on these collectivized farms. So all the livestock, all the produce, all the equipment, and all of the labor was collectivized on these farms. And so this obviously incurs a massive cost on the population, not just the kulaks who lost all of their property and their homes and all of that, but because agricultural output on that collectivized land goes down, it's going to cause widespread starvation. That's what. So this photo down here in the bottom right of corner of that slide is a group of kids. You could see them crowding around a body, somebody who had starved to death on the street, probably a member of that kulak group. One of the worst atrocities of this collectivization period in the first 5-year period, first 5-year plan, was called the Holodomor, which I'm going to go to the next slide here. This is in Washington, D.C. The Holodomor was a forced famine in the Ukraine because some of the peasants in the Ukraine were resisting collectivization. The Soviet government essentially stripped all of the food out of the Ukraine and left the people there to starve. And 3.6 million people are going to starve to death just in 1 year. And so this is the Holodomor monument in Washington, D.C. in the United States. And as you can see on the left, the grain is full and is present and everything. And as you go towards the right, the grain fades away into nothing, kind of symbolic of how food dwindled during that 1932, 1933 year. So this is the monument. It is actually just down the street from the Victims of Communism monument in Washington, D.C. So there's a monument there commemorating all victims who have died under communist regimes throughout the years. So this is just right down the street. Let's go ahead and move on to Stalin's Soviet Union. Life under the Stalin Soviet Party. Daily life wasn't that great. Things were still improving. Industry and agriculture had a lot of room to grow, but they were growing in some way. There was a housing crisis in the urban areas. There's a lot of homelessness and things like that. But in general, people in the Soviet Union had the vision that things would get better. They did have that hope and they did have that expectation. They weren't pessimistic about the future. They thought the future would be bright. And that was reflected in a lot of this propaganda. You see over here on the right-hand side, these three adults swarmed by children kind of marching into the future. This is the workers' paradise. And so they have the tools of agriculture and industry there. And they are marching into the future. Things are good. Women's roles changed a little bit. Stalin actually had put in place some laws to essentially liberate women, allowing them to get divorced and things like that. Whereas before they hadn't had those, Stalin wanted to strengthen what he saw as the traditional family unit. And so in order to do that, he stripped away a lot of those liberties that were given to women in the Soviet Union. I call them liberties in quotations because I wouldn't say that they were true liberties. They were just some minor reforms. Stalin gets rid of them though. And so women were able to be educated. Higher education was open to them and women took advantage of it in large numbers. And so I think by 1950, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 78% of the Soviet Union's doctors will be women. And so women did have access to higher education. Women did work outside the home. And so, women did have that role in society. And the politicized culture, artists and musicians and poets and authors and all of these people, they were pretty closely watched by the Soviet Union. especially at first. A little bit later in the 80s, that is going to change. But at first, really, they're kind of under the thumb of the government, and they're used as almost organic. Think of them as organic propaganda machines. They're organic in the sense that the propaganda is then coming from the people, that instead of the government kind of bringing that down on people, it's coming from them. The Kirkov murder, this is kind of a theme. A theme with these dictators that we're going to see is that they're taking advantage of chaos. Kirkov was Stalin's right-hand man, and when he is murdered, the murder takes place probably at Stalin's order. Stalin probably had the guy killed, but he makes it look like, anti-communist, that capitalists had him killed, and this is, the government is potentially in chaos, and so he uses this as an opportunity for what's called the Great Purges. He, in waves throughout the 30s, I think 36 to 39, he's able to get rid of people in the Soviet Union kind of at will, people that don't agree with him or people that have different ideas, even Communist Party members, kind of this middle group of them, and even higher members that maybe represent a threat to Stalin. He's able to get rid of them. And so at the bottom here, this is a picture of probably a village that was exterminated, a village that had maybe been causing problems or wasn't, doing what they should have been under the guise of the Great Purge, under the guise of the government is in danger. They're able to just simply get rid of these people. About 2 million people are arrested and never come back. So there's a secret police that come through, and they might take you in the middle of the night, and what they would do is probably torture you and then get you to maybe denounce some other people that might not be quite as bought into this idea as Stalin himself is. And I love this set of photos over on the right side of the slide. On top, you see the original photo, and on the bottom is the edited photo. This is 1930s Photoshop, where this guy on the left, whoever he was literally erased from history. He was purged, seen as not loyal enough or not communist enough or didn't agree with Stalin on everything. And so he was killed, and then this photo was doctored so that he would not appear in records of history. Is number one way to eliminate your enemy is to say that nobody ever disagreed with you. Those people didn't exist. And so those purges are going to eliminate a lot of the resistance. They have a kind of a mysterious origin because it's not entirely certain that there was that resistance to Stalin. It's thought that maybe, the Soviet Union is pretty secretive. It's hard to get numbers. It's hard to get exact records out of there. So historians kind of have to play this one by ear a little bit. One of the leading theories is that the resistance to Stalin didn't actually really exist, but he needed a show of force in order to convince the people that nobody should ever oppose him, that nobody should ever oppose this communist government. So it's thought that maybe he kind of manufactured this crisis. He obviously probably manufactured the Kirkov murder, but then manufactured the opposition to him just as a show of force to those who were left over. Again, kills about 2 million people, probably more. Again, figures are hard to get out of the Soviet Union and, still secretive Russia. So then we kind of move to Italy. After World War I, the government of Italy is seen as weak. There's a lot of inflation, and the government doesn't have the support of the Catholic Church, based in Rome. The government doesn't have the support of the socialists, who are going to become a really important force in not just Italy, but in Europe. The government doesn't have the support of the landed peasants or, kind of what used to be the nobility, this wealthy class. So the government really doesn't have the support of anybody. And Italy finds itself in a post-war crisis because Italy got almost nothing out of the Treaty of Versailles, whereas all these other nations, they're going to get land and they're going to get all these things. Italy gets almost nothing. The prime minister resigns after the Treaty of Versailles because of how little they get. Unemployment and inflation are rampant in Italy. And out of this crisis kind of comes Benito Mussolini. He becomes this political leader, and he's got his own militia called the Black Shirts. And they're the ones that are going to end up seizing power. You can see him here with a group of Black Shirts at the bottom. And over at the right, this is a pretty interesting picture. He himself is a war veteran, but when he comes into office, he never takes off the uniform. Neither does Stalin, neither does Hitler. beware of leaders who don't take off the uniform when they get into power. That's kind of been a theme with dictators throughout, since this period. So Mussolini is able to take control through the black shirts, his private militia, basically. They go town to town and they remove the local government, who people don't support, and they replace them with people that support Mussolini and his seizure of power. He has kind of this vision of it's a mixture of extreme nationalism and extreme socialism that he is basically going to brand that as fascism. He's going to be kind of the prototypical fascist here, and he's going to try and control all of these smaller towns. And because the people they put in power support him, they're going to vote him larger powers, which is where we're going next. So the government seems to be pretty moderate at first. They're going to grant some land reforms, and they're going to grant some financial and fiscal reforms and things like that. And what they end up doing is they write this weird little law in their parliamentary body that gives total power to whichever party has a simple majority. Basically, they rewrite the rule as if they get a simple majority, 51% of the vote, it goes on paper as they got 2/3 of the vote, which allows them to override any kind of vetoes or anything like that. And that's how Mussolini gets total power. And again, we have this other murder that takes place. The guy's name is Giacomo Matteotti. And so he is a socialist leader. And when he is murdered, there is this massive outcry from the socialist wing of the government. And it looks like they're going to topple this new Mussolini-led fascist government. Mussolini uses the crisis to suppress free speech, to kind of basically kill all the socialists who aren't part of his ultra-nationalist group. He's got the popular support of the peasants, of the Catholic Church, of the nobility, and of the people, with land, and the industrialists, and all of these people. They support him because it's at least different than what they had before, which was a weak government that couldn't get anything out of Versailles. They fought in World War I for nothing was the feeling. And so at least it's different. He gains the support of Catholics with the Lateran Agreement, the Lateran Treaty in 1929, which is actually this picture down here at the bottom. That is Mussolini sitting at the table on the right, and that is the Pope's Secretary of State. He's a cardinal, signing the Lateran Agreement, which basically recognized Vatican City as its own independent nation. And it compensated the Vatican, it compensated the Catholic Church for the land it lost in the Papal States. When Italy unified in the late 1860s, the Vatican lost, the Catholic Church lost the Papal States. That big section in Italy, if you think of Italy, the boot, it was basically the kneecap of Italy that the Catholic Church lost. So the new Italian government is going to pay the Catholic Church for that lost land. And that's kind of where we will pick it up next time in class. So thank you for watching, and I sure appreciate it.